So thank you so much for joining us here. It's a tremendous honor to be uh, back virtually to the University of Zurich, where I once visited years ago and had a lovely time. Um, I'm going to talk to you about a bunch of empirical findings, which I'm going to then try and organize into this theory that Andrea mentioned, the social baseline theory, and then pivot a little bit into wondering what this all means for how we communicate with each other in the digital age, especially in the age of COVID-19, which has raised some really important challenges. First, the good news, though. This is all good news. This is the fun stuff that I love to talk about. First thing I want to say is that simple handholding is good for you. It's good for your health and it's good for your well-being. Handholding is a human universal, and human universals, and for example, cultural anthropology and evolutionary anthropology, they're very hard to find and much sought after. Handholding is among them. I'm actually giving my talk from the Cueva de las Manos in Argentina. Actually, I'm in Virginia, but this is a virtual background of the Cueva de las Manos, where the hand stencils on the wall are some of the oldest pieces of art in the world by humans. These date to about 12 or 15,000 years ago. I can't quite remember. Handholding, good for you. Being with other people, good for you. This is a little example of one of my colleagues posting on Twitter how his daughter was going to school for the first time and was nervous going to the bus and was crying. And then her friend reached over and held her hand. And she stopped, turned, and never looked back, just went right into the bus. That's the sort of thing that you will see because hand-holding regulates threat vigilance. And I'm going to give you some evidence for that right now. We have this task. It's called the hand-holding task for reasons that will be obvious to you soon. We think of it as sort of our fruit fly because we do little tiny changes to this task to really isolate what it's telling us. The task goes like this. We bring dyads into the laboratory and we ask one of them to lie in the scanner while being confronted with these symbols, this red X and this blue O. The red X means they have a 20% chance of an electric shock to their ankle, which is mildly painful. And they do this several times under 3 conditions that are counterbalanced across conditions. They do it while they're holding hands with some kind of relational partner, with a stranger, or with no one at all. Okay, and then we're able to look at how the brain under threat processes threatening information under these different conditions. The very first study, going back to 2006 now, was a study of 16 couples. These were couples that were all white, all in highly educated, all middle class or higher, and all in relationships that they regarded as extremely satisfactory. Like these were off the charts. I was nervous. It's my first fMRI study. And so I stacked the deck in favor of the effect working by selecting a sample of people that didn't represent really anybody, but that seemed like handholding would have a big effect, and it in fact did. Show you really quickly. It's a lot of imagery right now, so I'm not going to get into the weeds too much, but I want to tell you that regions that you can see here in blue scattered throughout the brain were regions where holding any hand at all, spouse or stranger, seemed to be less active than being confronted with the threat by yourself. these are regions that seem to be involved. It's always a little bit tricky to make these kinds of inferences, but these are regions that seem to be involved in activating the body's general arousal response to threat. Regions in green are much more regulatory. They upregulate vigilance processing, or they downregulate emotional responses. And these were very selectively affected by handholding with a spouse. Remember, these are spouses that in relationships that were very highly unreasonably happy relationships. I keep making these jokes. Okay, the next study that we did was a much more generalizable study. Here we had 110 young adults in their early to mid 20s. This is a group that had been followed longitudinally by one of my colleagues for about 20 years. So we have a lot of information on them throughout their whole lives. They were very closely representative of the United States in terms of ethnic and racial composition, socioeconomic composition. And they were broken up into 29 dyads that were dating, 27 who were married, 27 who were friends, and 27 who were in cohabiting relationships. So we also expanded the kind of relationships that people were having. And what we find is that is the predicted effect of holding hands with a partner. Didn't really matter what kind of partner it was. Now, I put a little asterisk by that. I want to get through a lot of stuff, so I'm not going to get too much into the details of the study. I'll tell you that there was a minor effect of being married. So married couples seemed to do the best holding their hands. Couples that seemed to do the worst were couples that were holding hands with a cohabiting partner, even if we matched those relationships for the amount of time they'd lived together. So that's something that we need to sort of work out and understand. The kind of partner that was closest to being your marital spouse was a close friend. So friends and spouses seem to occupy a similar kind of space, but it's the cohabiting partners that seem to be a little bit outliers. If you look, in this study, this more generalizable study, you also see that two things that were different from the original study. When you look at the broader, more representative sample, it turns out that holding hands with a stranger is not as helpful to most people as it is to wealthy, educated white people. When we break that down, we find really that the socioeconomic status and race seems to possibly affect how much you expect strangers to be able to help you. And people who are relatively wealthy and white in the United States have this expectation, it seems, that strangers will be helpful, but others do not. We also found that holding hands with a relational partner was advantageous to holding hands to a stranger in this more representative sample in many or all of the regions that we found in that first study. So these are regions that are responsible for regulating affect and signaling to your cortex that the rest of your brain needs it to leap into action to figure out what's going on and how to regulate emotional responses. Going backwards now. Just other labs have been starting to do this work. We'd like to see more of this done. This is from Jack Blanchard and Louise Pessoa at the University of Maryland. And they did a study where they looked at hand-holding in people with schizophrenia. And this was really interesting because these were people with primarily negative symptoms in schizophrenia. So they didn't have friends to bring in, most of them. So what they did was a little manipulation before the study where they tried to basically make them a friend before doing the study, and that seemed to work. You see voxels here in regions like the right anterior insula, which is commonly implicated in our own hand-holding studies. Okay, so there's hand-holding regulating sort of the neural response to threat. But I also want to talk about health generally. One thing that you may know, but if you don't, I'm going to make it as starkly clear as possible, is that the more socially isolated you are, the more likely you are to die of anything at any time, no matter what your age or where you live or what culture you inhabit. Social isolation is extremely deadly for humans. That said, one of the things we found in our original study was that the hypothalamus, which is a region of the brain in the center of the brain that regulates all kinds of very important things. It regulates core body temperature, it regulates hunger, thirst, it regulates sexual activity, it regulates much of your body's downstream stress response. So under threat, the more active the hypothalamus is, the more likely your bloodstream is to be saturated by cortisol and epinephrine. And the cortisol is there to redistribute resources, bioenergetic resources from places like stores in your organs and your immune system, and dump those resources into your bloodstream for the purposes of dealing with the threat. And what we find here is that if you're holding hands with a partner, but not with a stranger or while you're alone, then the quality of your relationship seems to impact how much your hypothalamus is regulated. Higher quality relationships, less hypothalamic reaction to the threat. And at this point, we could infer, but we didn't know, that this might have some implications for general health. In that subsequent study with a much larger, more representative sample, we actually looked at regulation of the hypothalamus and its association with general health as measured by the SF-36. This is a self-report measure, but it is also a measure that has been, that seems to be highly correlated with objective measures of general health. So the way this pans out is that during hand-holding with a partner, but not stranger or alone, the more regulated your hypothalamus is, the better general health you enjoy. Okay, now I mentioned how cortisol is responsible for sort of moving bioenergetic resources from place to place in your body, in particular to take it out of your storage or to extract it like money from a bank account from your immune system, which is a very expensive system to run. And this led to a question that we had: what if one of the things that you find as an effect of the stress response is that glucose, which is the body's primary bioenergetic fuel, gets dumped into the bloodstream. And it gets dumped into the bloodstream because your brain is predicting that it'll need to use a lot of that fuel rapidly in large muscles to deal with a threat. So we wondered if circulating blood glucose varied as a function of access to social resources, given that we'd already been doing these hand-holding studies and seeing how it affected the brain. And here's what we found. I must be honest with you, this was not something that I took very seriously. This was something that a graduate student named Blair Gross did and tacked onto another study because she thought, well, there's this measure of attachment avoidance, which is a measure of how much you expect to deal with stress and threats by yourself, or maybe even prefer to deal with them by yourself. And she thought, well, can we measure blood glucose concentration in this sample that we also have an attachment measure? And I was like, sure, but you really think there's going to be, I mean, this is blood glucose and a paper and pencil measure. This is not going to work. But we got a high-end blood glucose meter so that we could reduce the error of measurement. And what we found in 60 undergraduate women here at University of Virginia was a pretty sizable correlation of 0.43 between attachment avoidance, again, expecting to deal with threats and stress on your own, and fasting basal glucose concentration. Those two red dashed lines on the lower part of the graph represent what most medical professionals believe is the normal range of basal blood glucose concentration. That upper dashed red line is above that point, it's considered a medical issue, that basal glucose concentration is too high, and there's probably something wrong. And you can see that people who are very high in avoidance are trending toward that high level. Well, I kind of couldn't believe it. It's just a single correlation. So I was presenting it back in the olden days. I think of wistfully when we used to travel places. I was in Israel, and I presented that correlation just sort of as a way to suggest future work. And it turned out a member of the audience, who's become a friend and collaborator, named Sachi Ein Dor, was there to realize that he had measures of fasting blood glucose in a sample of people that are all come from military records. And he had a measure of attachment avoidance. It wasn't the same one I used. For starters, it was in Hebrew, but it was it was a different measure entirely. He also had access to other measures that are known correlates already of fasting levels of blood glucose concentration. And so we could use those to partial out their effects before looking at the effects of avoidance. This couldn't have been a different sample. This is 285 people from Israel. 143 of them were women. Remember, the original sample was just 60 undergraduate women. These guys in Israel ranged from 42 to 90 years old. So, you know, things like DHEA cortisol ratios and hypertension, these are going to have real effects on your fasting glucose levels. We also had an anxiety measure. Turns out when we adjust statistically for those other known correlates, that if anything, the association between fasting glucose levels and attachment avoidance increased. And we took that to mean that when your brain predicts that when some unanticipated problem arises, you're going to have to deal with it by yourself, which is the one way to characterize attachment avoidance. Your body, your brain, ensures that you have higher levels of basal glucose in your bloodstream to cope by yourself with those unanticipated challenges. Okay. Turns out that we can regulate pain. This is very recent work. I want to just describe it for you real quickly. This is work I did with Marina Lopez Sola and Tor Wager. And what we did was we worked with, Tor had done a lot of work developing something called the neurologic pain signature. The neurologic pain signature is fascinating. This was published, I think, first in the New England Journal of Medicine, because he was able to use fMRI technology, such as we use a lot, to isolate a network responsive to pain stimuli in the brain that was 95+% sensitive to pain stimuli, and 95% plus specific to pain sensitivity. So it was a very, very reliable marker of subjectively experienced pain. And I got to talking with him, where else? At a conference. And he said that he has been trying to move the activation of the neurologic pain signature with various psychological interventions, and it just doesn't seem possible. One of the things to understand about how the brain processes pain is that there's this neurologic pain signature here that is basically receiving signals afferently from the body. And then there is another system that this system sends information to that sort of manages this information. This tends to be what we experience, right? So this is why, everyone from old monks in China to recent scientists of pain can talk about the difference between pain and suffering, right? You have an emotional component to the pain signal and the pain signal itself. And together in designing this study, we felt that we were going to show ample regulation of the emotional aspect of pain while not being able to affect the neurologic pain signature with our hand-holding task. Because hand-holding we thought of as a psychological intervention. And again, all the other psychological interventions he'd tried didn't work. Okay, first thing, this is a little bit made complicated to see, but we definitely had an effect on pain unpleasantness. When people were holding hands and using our paradigm, their unpleasantness with the pain stimulus, and it was a hot thermode that we attached to their arm, and we cranked up the heat really fast. So even though it never got hot enough to hurt them in any way, the vector, the speed at which it heated up would always trick them into thinking that they were being burned when they weren't actually. So the pain unpleasantness was less during handholding with their partner. Emotional comfort was higher, and the greater the emotional comfort they felt, the less pain they seemed to report. So that's just their subjective report. I've already talked about what the neurological pain signature is. But what I want to show you here is that to our shock, and in some ways, I'm hiding this from you because I like to look smarter than I am, but I usually, most of my hypotheses fail. And this one was no exception. I hypothesized that we would not be moving the neurologic pain signature because we couldn't, because it's not responsive to psychological interventions. But hand-holding moved it. It moved it during both blasts of heat. And we still don't really understand why. But what it suggests is that the touch of someone's hand, for the first time, perhaps in our studies, we are starting to really realize that although it's not all about hand-holding, and I'll get to that later, boy, hands are special. Touching is special when it comes to regulation. And of course, here we see the whole brain attenuations of pain activity by hand-holding. This is what we predicted. So at least one of the hypotheses was correct. This is the more distributed pain system that we think of as the sort of affective or regulatory component of processing pain information that we experience. And not only that, when you saw reductions in this affective system, that seemed to mediate the decrease in subjective pain experience pretty well. So we get some real mechanisms in this study of how the brain takes supportive touch and turns it into less pain through this affective pain system. Just by way of summarizing, because I don't really have time to get into every study we've done, and I would like to, but I can't. So to summarize, I'm going to talk about a few regions of the brain that we see effects in commonly, and these will become important in a minute. You don't have to really know the brain to think about this. They are the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which is associated with sort of signaling the brain's need for top-down regulatory control of emotion, of attention, some combination of them all, of impulses, that sort of thing. You have the anterior insula, which is paying close attention to what's happening to your body. You have the DLPFC, which is following the DACC's command in enacting the top-down regulation that's signaled as needed by the DACC. And then you have the hypothalamus, which is regulating further downstream biological systems, resources, real resources that your body uses or not, okay? And what we see when we look at all these different kinds of people with whom you can hold a hand, stranger doesn't really affect any of these particular regions. The stranger affects other kinds of regions that we won't talk a lot about because the stranger's a very weird, we realized it's a kind of relationship, but it's one I just don't understand very well. I don't think any of us understand it. I don't think humans understand strangers very well because we didn't evolve with strangers. Most humans, I had an anthropologist tell me after one of these talks that most humans who ever lived on the planet Earth never met a stranger in their entire life, unless they were like 2 and just learning about their community. But anyway, friends seem very reliably to downregulate these regions. So do spouses. So do spouses. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more. Down here, the little TX is there to remind me that these are spouses that got marital therapy, that were unhappy at first, but we made them happier. You see this in dating relationships, the DACC and the DLPFC, cohabiting, spouse, parent handholding. Only with spouses and parents do you tend to see hypothalamic regulation. Only with spouses and parents. Although we did find it in one news reporter that we brought in who came down with her very best friend. And in a single subject, we found her very best friend regulating her hypothalamus. They were close. And also the neurologic pain signature. So that's dating couples were able to do that. These were couples that in the neurologic pain signature I didn't mention were just dating with each other. So we don't know how much stronger that would be if we were looking at couples that were married or people that coming in with their parents, for example. Okay, I'm not tracking the time, but I think I've got a little while, about a half an hour or more. There's also regulating of what I call the self. So far we've talked about regulating threat responses, regulating bioenergetic resources, regulating pain. And now we're going to this gets a little almost spooky because what is the self anyway, right? That becomes part of the question. And I just first want to talk about just what we did by way of answering this. What is this? I've been signed out. Are you guys still hearing me?
Yeah, this
Yes.
is perfect.
Okay, okay, good. That was a weird, unpleasant alert I just got. Okay, regulation of the self. What do I mean by that? Let me put it together by first just telling you what we did. We did a version of our handholding study where we decided to shock everyone. So these were the people in the scanner and people out of the scanner. This allowed us to look at the same brain on the same occasion of measurement, looking at the same symbols, threat and non-threat, varying only who the threats were directed at. And sometimes they were directed at the self while holding hands with a stranger or a friend or while alone. And sometimes they were directed to the other, which in this case would be the friend or the stranger. Okay. And what we found, initially we designed this to have a sort of look at how ability to receive help might be correlated to their ability to feel empathy for others. And what we found was that here we're looking at the lateral prefrontal cortex. This is one of those regions that's always implicated in our hand-holding studies, that's responsible for regulating affect. If you look here on this y-axis in the first graph, that's the threat to self activation in this region. And down here on the x-axis, that's the threat to friend. In the same brain, in the same region, the threat, it's just that the threat's directed at the friend. And you can see that the correlation there is quite high. But if you look at the same graph, looking not at the friend, but at the stranger, there's no correlation at all. So thinking about what this is, it means that if you found the threat very threatening, then you also found it very threatening to your friend. If you found the threat not threatening at all, then you also didn't think it was threatening to your friend. But when the threat was directed at a stranger, you seem to register no idea what they might be responding like. You certainly didn't think they would respond the way you did. And this is really interesting because it's not just that you're empathizing. It seems to be that you are assuming that your friend, your close friend, is going to respond the way that you do. And we think, well, I'll explain in a moment, this unlocks something really important about the human brain. First of all, that self-friend correlation I just showed you, I could show you graph after graph after graph after graph after graph. It was all over the brain for the self-friend correlation. There was only one self-stranger correlation in the right orbital frontal cortex, which seemed to suggest to us that even though you had no expectation that the stranger would respond the way you would, you knew that shocking someone was bad. So that was encouraging. Even in an American sample. Shame on me. This was very interesting because there's this old idea, not that old, in the early 90s, out of social psychology called the inclusion of the other in the self. And this was originally described in this way by Arthur Aaron. He developed this scale, which you're looking at here, which is a series of differently overlapping circles, Venn diagrams, featuring the self and the other. There are a couple of things about this scale that's wonderful. One of them is that psychometrically, it's super portable to cultures everywhere. Everyone understands what this means more or less almost instantly. So it's a really nice psychological instrument for that reason. The other thing is that it really does seem to measure the degree to which we sort of include others in our self-concept. Real quick finding from this work is that the higher your circles with someone overlap, the harder it is for you and your person, whoever that person is, to remember who did what when you have to do this little paper tower building task in the laboratory earlier in the day. If the person you do that task with overlaps high with you, then you get confused about literally whose hands were doing what things. But if they don't overlap, you have no such confusion. What we think we're seeing is in our data is that we kind of stumbled upon a neural definition of familiarity with another person, which is that the other person is sort of grafted on to the self in a way that was originally written about conceptually by Arthur Aaron in the early 90s. And in fact, we have looked at the correlation between the iOS, this inclusion of the other in self scale, with voxels, regulatory voxels of the brain during a threat to friend task, and contrasted that with a threat to stranger task. And you see no correlation at all during the threat to stranger, but plenty and robustly you see it in the threat to friends. So this idea of self-other overlap seems to be strong here. Okay, one more regulation thing, regulating perception. We think this is really important. What I'm showing you here is a hill not far from where I am now. It's in West Virginia in a wilderness called the Dolly Sods Wilderness. It's beautiful. And one of the things that I want to tell you about is a series of studies by my friend Denny Prophet. There's a new book out called just Perception, which I highly recommend, where he has people stand at the bottom of hills and estimate how steep the slant of the hill is. And what he finds is that people normatively way overestimate the slant of a hill. And he knows why. It's because our brains are managing those bioenergetic resources that we were talking about earlier. On balance, brains and bodies are lazy. Okay, that's just a principle. Brains are lazy. If we can get something for less, we will almost always do it. And on balance, it costs a body less to not walk up a hill than it costs to walk up a hill. So we overestimate in our perception how steep a hill is in order to persuade our perceptual apparatus to persuade the rest of our brain not to walk up the hill. It has to be something really amazing at the top to motivate us to go up there. What he also finds is that if you put on a heavy backpack that weighs about 20% of your body weight, people systematically perceive the hill to become yet steeper. And that's because their bioenergetic resources are taxed further. So what might be the implication for this management of literal bioenergetic resources via perception of overlap between yourself and the other that you've come to know and be acquainted with? Well, one implication might be that you see hills differently. And in fact, my colleague Simone Schnall, working with Denny Prophet, did just such a study where he had people wearing their heavy backpacks standing at the base of that hill, either by themselves or with a close friend. And what do you know? When the friend was just standing right next to them, the steepness of the hill decreased to their pre-backpack levels. So we think that what's happened here is that the brain is not only perceiving things in order to manage resources, but that we perceive other people as literally part of our bioenergetic store to apply to dealing with things in the world, that our brain plays a kind of perceptual trick on us as we become close with each other, and the other becomes part of the self. And that self is then more efficacious in the world. And because we do it with each other, we all get to benefit. Very quick aside, given that I've given you the data, I was consulting on a clinical case one time, not long after this study came out. And it was a case of a woman being reunited with her daughter after having gone through a drug treatment program. It's a good mom who had a drug problem, and she had done a lot of work, and she was being reunited with her child who had been staying with a grandparent for a while. And we're sitting in the room, and I'm not in the room, it's a videotape. I'm watching the tape of this therapist sitting in the room with them. He was going to broker this reunion. And anyway, the mom walks in the room and the child runs over and leaps into her arms and turns back to face the camera and says, I'm not kidding, says, "How tall am I? Because I'm feeling taller." This is a drawing I did of it, by the way. And there's going to be more drawings. I can't help it. I like to draw. But early on in my career, I might have regarded this as a cute kid metaphor. But now, given what I've just told you, I honestly believe that kid feels taller because her mom's taller, and her mom is part of what herself is constituted of. Her mom's capabilities are part of what she's capable of. And so she's taller. It's not confusing if you're a child. Okay, so the conclusion at this point is that supportive touch regulates threat-related brain activity. Okay, it also signals a bunch of things. Social resources signal access to resources proportional to the expansion of the self. We think that the self includes the other into it, and so it becomes more efficacious in dealing with the demands of the world. And when you've got more resources to bring, then that signals less demand for top-down regulatory control, which is why the DACC in your brain, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, goes a little bit silent. And so does your lateral prefrontal cortex. There's less demand for self-focused vigilance. There's less demand for some redistribution of bodily resources from maintenance and immune system to an emergency focus. And there's less attention, surprisingly to me, less attention even to pain afferents. So this is all great. Social networks are really good for us. What this has suggested to us over time is something called social baseline theory. And it's not intended to be contrary to or antagonistic with attachment theory, but it is intended to be a more generalized statement of the social body, as you might say. Now, this map I'm showing here is a map of the human footprint index. And the more sort of orange and red and pink and black it gets, the more human feet are walking around on the ground. And I hope that you can see that humans are in a lot of places on this earth. We are walking all over this planet. Well, social baseline theory at its base suggests that the social regulatory effects that I've just been describing, they can be viewed as just the body's dependence on its ecological niche, like any other animal. Listen, if you are studying, say, a salamander here in the mountains of Virginia, that salamander is adapted to a niche. That niche is damp, cold, dark environments where it can find bugs, right? And if it doesn't have that environment, it mounts a stress response. And the stress response is for the purpose of getting it back to that environment. That's what the stress response is for. What social baseline theory proposes is that our ecological niche, the human ecological niche, the human habitat, is really anything that includes other humans. That the primary component, the primary universal issue, I mean, we live everywhere. We live on unrefined grains and on whale blubber and in very hot climates and very cold climates and dry and wet and high elevation, low elevation. We've been on the moon. We've gone to the bottom of the ocean. We're probably going to go to Mars. If there are other people there, we are relatively close to our ecological niche. So what we're not really seeing is other people applying a regulatory force. What we're really seeing in all of the research I've taught you is what happens when you take the niche away. We're seeing an effect of the alone condition more than we are of the handholding conditions, because the handholding condition is closer to the social baseline, which is our ecology. It's got to sink in a little bit. So this means that social behavior, if you expand this, we're getting to COVID here for a second. This means that our social behavior itself constitutes a terrestrial environment. One that travels, there it is, the footprints all over the world, and I think affords unparalleled adaptability and behavioral flexibility. The primary adaptation given the habitat that we inhabit is adaptability. We are flexible. Our habitat is comprised of, is made of cooperation, shared goals, and joint attention. And therefore, it requires other people. It requires social bonds. We're used to thinking of habitats in flora and fauna terms, but habitats can be anything, and habitats can be patterns of behavior, including handholding, like all that handholding I've been talking about. I think there's a good reason that handholding is a human universal. That was the good news. Okay, we can all feel nice now. If you have someone with whom you can hold hands, that's foreshadowing. You can go hold hands with them later. Now we're going to get to the bad news. Okay, there's bad news to be had. Welcome to 2020. This is California. I don't know how much of the news you've been following, but California's been on fire for most of the year. Unprecedented fires so large and so out of control that they are causing scientists who study forest fires to have to abandon models of how forest fires behave and are dealt with, which means they're unprecedented. And it just so happens that this fire is burning down a senior center where many seniors died of COVID, and where it is encouraging us kindly on the outside to wear our masks, wash our hands, social distance, stay safe. This year has been truly rough. And that's not all that's bad about it. The coronavirus, which is causing a lot of our grief this year, not all of it. We won't have time to talk about climate change, but I'd love to. The coronavirus loves this high human footprint index. Coronavirus is a virus. It doesn't love anything, but you get what I mean. It thrives on the fact that there are so many humans around because it has adapted itself to the human social environment. Remember, our social behavior constitutes a habitat for us, which means it's an exploitable habitat for any other critter. Ask your dog. And so among the critters, sorry, that's a very informal United States word for formless, nameless animal. Among the critters that have adapted themselves to our environment is a virus that kills us mercilessly. This has happened before, and it will happen again because we have a habitat that we've created. So our social niche, our environmental niche, is shared with a deadly virus, and we have no vaccine. What should we do? Well, we kind of know what we should do. I'm going to focus on the things that get the most play. We know that we need to keep distant from loved ones and friends, and this is going to be really hard. We connect across Zoom like you and I are doing now. Other things that you should probably know how to cope is get exercise, go outdoors, go for walks, limit your doom scrolling on Facebook and Twitter. Don't do that. It's bad for you. Establish a routine. Take a shower in the morning. A lot of people are not doing that. Try not to drink too much, even though wine is nice right now. Okay, so for starters, we have to be physically distant. But if our research that I've just been describing to you is correct, then all of this problem, this sharing of our own habitat with this deadly virus, should result in a diminution, a shrinking of our sense of self as we lose contact possibly with close loved ones, but also colleagues at work, and even these things called small or weak ties. I don't know about you, but I love to go to my grocery store because I go there quite a lot. I know one or two people who work there by name, but mostly I just know their faces. They know mine. Every time I see them, we go, hey, you know, or whatever. We're Americans, hey, you know. And so I get something from that I'm not getting now. And I think that it threatens to constrict our sense of self. And that literally means decreases in our perceived efficacy in the world, that we're going to perceive the world as more demanding. And so we're going to engage in more costly forms of self-regulation. That prefrontal cortex is going to be working. We're going to have increased threat vigilance. And many of us, especially because it's chronic, are going to have chronically high levels of stress hormones and basal blood glucose levels. And that chronically high level of cortisol is going to chronically deplete our immune system's ability to fight off infection, which, that's exactly what we don't need right now. We might even be experiencing more physical pain as a result. Maybe you've noticed more aches and pains, or you get tired. A lot of people report just being tired a lot during what we're going through. So what do we do? Is there anything that I have to offer here other than, you know, get a virtual Zoom-based CBT therapist and hope for the best? Yeah, I have some ideas. And the first starts with, we've been talking about hand-holding. I've even mentioned how hand-holding is pretty special, but I want to say, don't focus too much on touch. Touch is special, hand-holding is special, but it's not the thing that we're talking about. What we're talking about is the social regulation of our sense of self, our perception, the way that we perceive demands in our own efficacy in the world, and ultimately our health and well-being. So how do we access those kinds of advantages potentially without touch? Well, I think we have to, by the way, I hope, can I go a little over time? All right, she's going, yeah, what is it? Zoom. It's COVID. It didn't just touch. So first thing I want to say about this next study is we didn't shock children. That didn't happen. Even I would not do that. But we did work with another group that was doing a study of anxious children, highly anxious children, in comparison to, these are children with diagnosed anxiety disorders, getting brain scans, doing various other tasks, in comparison to kids with no such disorders. And I kind of jumped in there and said, hey, how about we add a condition where mom is in there with them or not? And for various reasons, we couldn't work out a hand-holding manipulation. So we had to settle for just mom standing next to the kid and telling the kid that that was the case. And what we find is that here's the hypothalamus, by the way, responsible for those stress hormones and that redistribution of bodily resources. If a highly anxious kid was with her parent, with his or her parent, that kid was indistinguishable from the control kids with no anxiety. It was the highly anxious kids by themselves who showed the increased activity in the hypothalamus and also in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, also part of our regulatory apparatus. So here we're seeing the effect of regulation without hand-holding. But the other thing I want to tell you about is this great study I did with Susan Johnson. She's a psychologist emeritus at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And she's the developer of emotionally focused therapy for couples. And we sort of realized that, her intervention was a perfect way for me to test whether you could change the hand-holding effect. And my research was a perfect way for her to test mechanisms of her therapy. So we decided to do an initial little collaboration, which we are intending to expand into a much larger study. But this is a study where we brought couples in. There were 24 distressed couples. They were really distressed. Many of them described themselves as being on the verge of divorce. We put only the women in the scanner, and we gave them a scan, a pre-scan, and then 20 weeks of emotionally focused therapy from Susan's group, from her actual group that she supervised. And then we put them back in the scanner. This is a lot. Sorry about that. I got excited looking at this slide, and I just started scribbling on it, and I didn't have time to not make it scribbles. So I hope you don't mind a little handwriting. But this is what Sue calls dancing the EFT tango. These are the 5 basic moves of EFT. And I find them a little jargony, so I wanted to say about them what I think. Part 1 involves working with a couple to figure out what their complaints are. And that often means sort of reflecting on scary relationship fears and feelings, things that scare the members of the couple. Then you work to uncover deeper fears, often fears of abandonment and such. You repeat a kind of graduated exposure to openly discussing those feelings, so you get more used to being vulnerable. This is where we start closing into the key to what we need to do in the age of COVID. And then you go through what sort of I think of as vulnerability training. You reveal these deep fears, these anxieties, these insecurities over and over again, while Sue, or the EFT therapist, trains you both to respond with compassion and support instead of with, I don't know, an eye roll or, a deal with it or feeling overwhelmed or whatever it is. And you do that over and over again until you train a couple to take care of each other emotionally. And what we find, by the way, this therapy has the largest empirical database supporting it of any marital intervention that's ever been invented. And what you find is that, in fact, before this process, couples that are distressed show no effect in, here's the DACC, the DLPFC, these regions that are all commonly affected in our studies. But after post-EFT, you see the effect really strongly. Okay, so not a proper control group. There's all kinds of other issues that we're seeking to follow up with in a better, broader study. But this is initial evidence, at least, that we can change things. But that's not really the point. The point here is that we changed things not by hand-holding practice. Hand-holding was still the mechanism we used during the scans, but what we changed was their relationship. What we changed was their ability to feel vulnerable and respond actively to that vulnerability. So this is all about way more than learning about supportive touch. Okay, touch isn't the thing. The thing is this. It's a sequence. It goes like this. Sorry, again, this popped into me. I wanted to write this shortly before the talk, and I just wrote it down. The sequence goes like this. At time 1 in this sequence, whichever partner you are, whichever person you are, you express vulnerability. Express vulnerability. That's a dangerous thing for your brain to do. That's a dangerous thing for your brain to do. And that's why we call it being vulnerable, because it literally is being vulnerable. When you let down your defenses, which is to say you relax your own threat vigilance and reveal your weakness, you are more vulnerable than you were before. At time 2, someone else responds positively. They reach out and give you a hand. They talk to you in comforting tones. They reassure you. The hypothesis is that enacting this sequence, even via things like Zoom, will have effects that are similar to close proximity, even hand-holding. The question is then, how do we enact this sequence and what should we do? The answer, I think, is probably there are lots of things. We could maybe do EFT with our spouse. That's a big investment. But for some evidence, we can start watching the news. I'm going to show you some of my drawings here, my personal drawings. And I do these for a class that I teach here at UVA called Why We Hold Hands. This is a drawing I made a few years ago of Notre Dame burning in Paris. I don't know about you, but when this happened, it was immediately on the news here in the US. And I kind of freaked out. Paris is one of my favorite cities. Notre Dame is well known to me. It's one of my most beloved places. And I couldn't take my mind off of it. And I was shocked. I was deeply shocked in a way that many other kinds of tragedies are deeply shocking. But this seemed impossible to me at the time. And then I thought, well, gosh, what would it be like to be a Parisian, during this moment? And in fact, we know what it was like, because many Parisians on the streets of Paris who did not know each other at all spontaneously started singing while all gazing up at the burning structure. There were many videos of this. I don't know if you saw any of these, but it was quite moving. Why did they do that? Well, it turns out that people sing and dance all over the world in every single culture, just like hand-holding. And they tend to do it more often. They're always doing it, but they tend to do it more often when they're under lots of stress, particularly collective stress. So there's more singing and more dancing during war, during famines, during natural disasters. This is a clue to what's going on. And this is a drawing of me talking with the researcher who I'm quoting here. Her name is Ellen Dissanayake. She's at the University of Washington. She's actually in the music department, I believe, but she's an anthropologist. And she's telling me in this drawing that, in fact, these kinds of rituals, this ritual activity, happens more often during times of mental stress. Okay. And it seems to be something that we do really naturally. And in fact, I'm going to go back just a minute. In fact, we saw this in Italy. I don't know if you remember, in northern Italy, I can't remember the name of the town right now, I should, but that was very, very powerfully initially hit by COVID. The death rate was beyond imagining. And there was a lot of fear. And what started happening is that people started going out onto their balconies and singing to each other all over the city. There are many different videos of this also online that you can find. And I think this was a sort of vocal equivalent of hand-holding with each other. It was a way to make connection with sound waves that we created with our bodies, and that connect with our bodies, with our ears. So what have I been telling people in the news media? Whoops. Oh, where did I go? Okay, I lost my screen for a second. I have been telling people, I've been talking to a lot of news media saying, what do I do? What do we do? I don't know for sure, but I have a lot of faith based on our work in this and a lot of other work in a lot of other domains in psychology, in this sequence. I've written a chapter about it that goes from vulnerability to a positive response. This responsiveness, the attachment people have been writing about this since Bowlby, at least. Responsiveness to distress, or more generally, responsiveness to vulnerability. So my advice to people has been, practice vulnerability. Most of us, most people that we know in our lives will respond positively to that. But it's harder to think of being vulnerable as a skill that needs to be cultivated. We've actually named that skill yielding. We call it yielding in our studies. We're going to be writing about that soon. Yielding is a trait, an ability to be vulnerable with other people, to yield your efforts to their support. And yielding is something we need to think about more in psychology and in neuroscience. Now, what you're looking at here is my last iteration of the Zoom class that I taught here at UVA, of my Why We Hold Hands class. And, or do I need to stop? We over time? I'm almost done.
Maybe
I just wanted to.
You start concluding.
Oh, oh yeah, this is the conclusion. This is it. I just wanted to play you them singing together because I asked them to do this. This is a class that's basically a class on the neuroscience and evolution of social relationships. And they each sent me a recording, and I sort of stitched all those recordings together. The song that they sung was just a little piece of, was suggested by my 9-year-old girl, Lulu. And it's a lovely little piece. It's very short. And here it is. I want to tell you what happened when I had them do this assignment. Many of them reported to me that they felt like this was a kind of an unbelievable experience for them. These are a lot of STEM students, math, science, biology, engineering, and they felt much more closely bonded to each other. I've done this in person with classes, small groups, and people immediately start taking selfies with each other and so forth. It's because the sequence of being vulnerable and responding positively creates bonds. That's what it does. And bonds are how we increase our efficacy in the world and conserve our bioenergetic resources. All right. That is, I just want to thank some people, funding agencies, and that is all I have for you. Thank you for your patience.